Okay, we can begin, Anthony.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us here today. I'll begin with a roll call of the members of the subcommittee. I'll start with Ms. Stacy Brodson Rizzo,
Here.
Ms. Susan Gravellesi,
Here.
and then Anthony D'Ambrosio, which is me. I'd also like to recognize other committee members who have joined us, Mr. Michael Ferranti and Ms. Carol Ty. Thank you all for joining us today, and obviously to the superintendent and her wonderful health team that she has with us. So the way that I envision this meeting going broadly is I'd like to lay out the framework through which I am viewing this reopening issue and this safe in-person potential reopening discussion. I'd like to ask a few questions and then obviously hope that my fellow committee and subcommittee members can add on their own individual questions about the reopening model that the superintendent was kind enough to circulate last week. But just to start, I don't think there's any doubt that we sit here today amidst a crisis of massive proportions. COVID-19 has challenged this community to its very core, and it'll continue to do so for the foreseeable future. The superintendent has been placed along with the rest of her team in something of an impossible situation here. And we just need to consider all factors incredibly carefully. I thought that it was important to have this meeting today to focus specifically and solely on the issue of safe school reopening, and more specifically to discuss whether or not a safe and in-person reopening is even feasible or possible. We can't make any mistake here. This is obviously one of the most important decisions that our district will ever make. Lives stand in the balance, and this is literally a life or death situation for many of our students, educators, and community members. That should be the broader sort of framework of our analysis here, and I think you would all agree. While the superintendent has been given an impossible task, I do have some serious concerns about potentially reopening in person, and my concerns extend to the proposed hybrid model of reopening. And I'm basically unwilling at this point to consider a fully in-person model of reopening, as a lot of you probably are. I understand the harm that a lack of in-person education may cause students. The massive potential harm for infection and spread of COVID-19 in our schools and greater community is undeniable at this point. This entire conversation and process is sort of an exercise in harm reduction. We need to make a decision that will lead to the least amount of harm for our community members, for our students, educators, and families. Just to sort of provide a brief overview and refresher of the science that's undeniable here. A clustering of students will lead to more infections, which will likely lead to more hospitalizations and likely deaths ultimately in our community. I think that we just need to be as clear as possible about this and about the science and ultimate domino effect that it entails. More clusters of students leads to more infections, which leads to more hospitalizations and deaths. At this point, if she's able, I'd love if the superintendent could put up the chart that I forwarded her earlier. I think that this will give us a sort of a helpful reference point. This chart is available on the City of Revere's website. Just let me know when you're able to put it up. And as you'll see in a moment, thank you so much. As you'll see in one moment, this chart displays the past 2 weeks positive test rate in our city through July 29th. As it stands, this positive test rate is more than 3 times the state average, and it outpaces the surrounding cities like Everett and Chelsea by more than 50%. I repeat, and this is significant, this current data shows that COVID positivity rate in Revere is outpacing our neighboring cities by more than 50%. It's clear that our community is faring far worse than the Commonwealth as a whole. And as of this morning, there have been 2,043 cases and 93 deaths in the city. The 7-day rolling average of new cases is at 12.1. And since July 15th, at which there was a positive test case plateau of 4%, cases have trended upward sharply to 6.5%. This is well and significantly above the CDC's hotspot designation of 5%. It's also important to remember that obviously Revere is not like other cities and towns. We're a highly populated city with high density living conditions. Many families live with several generations, children, parents, and grandparents within the same household. The median age of the city is higher than that of the US at large, and the immigrant population by percentage is also higher than that of the US at large. As we know, both older and immigrant community members face increased susceptibility to COVID-19 and are disproportionately vulnerable to illness, infection, and death. Our demographical community makeup puts us in an extremely difficult position here, which is something that we have to keep in the back of our minds. Another component of our framework of analysis should be, or should consider, the latest vaccination trial data, which is coming out very quickly now. On July 20th, preliminary results from the clinical trial of the vaccine from Oxford University showed that healthy participants had strong antibody and T cell responses up to 56 days into the ongoing study. The week prior to that, the Moderna vaccine candidate was reported to have induced positive immune responses in all of its volunteer patients. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 150 vaccines are preparing to or have already entered clinical trials. And as I speak right now, the US government is spending billions on infrastructure to mass produce these vaccines. The UK and US have already paid hundreds of millions of dollars for over 2 billion doses of the Oxford vaccine alone. And as recently as yesterday, White House COVID-19 advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, stated that he was optimistic that a vaccine will likely be available by December of this year or January of next. Given the positive trend of vaccine research, I wonder what the rush to reopen in person is. I mean, the science is relatively clear here. More cases will lead to more hospitalization, which leads to more deaths. How can we possibly restart in-person instruction, even under a hybrid system, given Revere's most recent case trends and the somewhat encouraging prospects of a vaccine in the near future? How can we put our community at further risk here is the broader question. And why allow our children to be essentially experimental test subjects for in-person reopening with the vaccination data in mind? With all of that said, and sort of as a backdrop, I have 5 sort of core questions that I'd like to ask the superintendent. She has them in writing, but I'll run through them quickly right here. And they all have to do specifically with the proposed model for reopening that she was, kind enough to work through and circulate last week. First is that the hybrid model discusses screening for students, educators, and staff. Does that screening include COVID medical testing, actual COVID tests? And if so, do we have the tests and resources to do it? If we do, how do we control for delays in test response times? The second broad question is, how do we control for the 20 to 40% of asymptomatic COVID carriers that studies show exist? The third is that the reopening model states that only workers with quote unquote medium and high risk of exposure, like drivers and nurses, will receive certain selective PPE materials. Shouldn't we also, if the resources provide for it, be providing this equipment to all school teachers and staff? The fourth is that COVID is primarily spread through air droplets within confined areas. We know that, and the data is relatively clear in that regard. How do we ensure that the air ventilation in our classrooms is adequate, especially during the winter? If we are talking about opening windows or doors, what is going to happen in January or February? My final core question is that the plan calls for students to be eating lunch in classrooms silently and without masks. How do we ensure that they're eating silently? And even if they are, how are we controlling for the fact that COVID is spread respiratorily? Even if they're not talking, chewing, breathing, all of these are massive COVID spreaders within a confined area. How do we control for that? So those are my 5 sort of core questions. I'd love for the superintendent or health team to sort of address some of those. And then obviously I'd love for the committee to jump on if possible. Thank you.
So I do have the questions written down, Anthony, and I want to begin by saying, or reiterating, I should say, as I said in our town hall meeting last week, that our number 1 concern is student and staff safety, and that the numbers in there right now do not support opening schools for in-person learning. And that is because our positivity rate exceeds the 5% that all of the experts have agreed is a good threshold for coming together in person. So that's kind of like the first step. If that number doesn't come down, then we're talking about a moot point. But if that number does come down, then as much as COVID is a concern for everybody in every community and every society, there is evidence from various medical researchers and scientists that say bringing kids back together in safe ways with adequate precautions can be better for them, especially for their mental health and their social emotional learning. Those benefits would outweigh the risk of a spread of COVID. So we're considering all of that, and our teams considered all of that information as they developed the plan that we did put forward. I do want to address some of your questions specifically. So one of them, in regards to the screening, what we're asking folks to do right now, and this is on recommendations of the CDC and the Department of Education, and a big piece of our guidance came from the Parabola Project. And we put documentation on the Parabola Project on our website. There's a link there for families or anybody else who wants to look at it. But significant contributions there come from MIT and Harvard and the brightest minds in the country, far brighter than I am, about the safety of children. And so what we are expecting folks to do right now, both staff and families, is to self-check before school and not send kids to school if they have a fever, not come in if you're a staff member with a fever or exhibiting other symptoms. And our nursing team is working on a checklist for parents that they can look at every morning in order to get that done. We have already established a contact tracing program through our student information system where we can track any suspected or positive students and staff and their in-district contacts through that program. But we're also exploring, and I have a meeting with the mayor's office tomorrow and with the Revere Board of Health about a partnership with a program called Safer Teachers, Safer Students. And that's organized by a group of medical and infectious disease doctors through the Broad Institute, Tufts Medical Center, Mass Medical, BU Medical, and Bristol Myers Squibb. And that information on that program is in the mayor's hands right now and with the Board of Health, as I mentioned tomorrow to talk about that. It involves a testing program for all members of the school community, students and staff, that would start with a baseline test prior to any in-person learning. And after that, all staff and selected students would continue to be tested weekly for the following 11 weeks, which brings us through November. And the thought is that by engaging in a program like that, we would be able to track and trace non-symptomatic carriers to reduce transmission, not only in the school department, but in the city at large. The program calls for local labs to conduct the actual testing, and the group leading this charge has already identified several, and they've promised a less than 24 hours turnaround on the results so that we can act swiftly and quickly on those results. Wellesley Public Schools is actually a lead partner, but they're working together to develop a coalition of districts that represent the diversity in the Commonwealth. So Revere is one of the candidates, and Chelsea is also a candidate, because one of the things they want to do is make sure that they're providing equitable access to timely testing and results. And the data will allow us to assess, on top of the things they'll do around contact tracing and early identification, it's also going to let us assess whether or not our safety protocols, such as social distancing and mask wearing, are working. And then if there is a surge in cases in Massachusetts, we'll know precisely whether or not it's happening in our schools and in the community of Revere. The biggest challenge we have with that program right now is that the estimated cost is around $2.5 million. So the Broad is working on a funding source, and the other partners are working on funding sources, but we need to do that as well as a city, and that's going to be part of the conversation that I have with the mayor's office tomorrow. So I think that's about where we are with contact tracing and testing and making sure that our students and staff have access to testing that would be free to them. In terms of the medium and at-risk exposure, like for drivers and nurses, as I mentioned before, our opening plan guidance was driven by several resources that are connected to the school district website. I urge people to go there and look through all of the documents that are there. But the guidance does specify different kinds of PPE for some staff members. For example, clear face masks for speech therapists and English learner teachers and teachers of younger students and others who are working on articulation and foundational language skills as a primary part of their learning process. And the guidance from DESE and others calls for gowns and face shields and goggles and other more advanced PPE to be provided to staff members who may come in contact with bodily fluids, particularly while toileting young children and our children with special needs. A recommendation of the reopening team was to provide face shields for bus drivers. I don't oppose that, but I believe that what our medical professionals across the Commonwealth and the country are indicating as appropriate is what we should follow. And that's what our plan is based off of. And that's why we identified certain individuals who have the more advanced PPE than others. With our HVAC system, and I want to recognize that ventilation systems in schools are historically of poor quality and don't work well. But I also want to acknowledge that that's not the reality in Revere. Unlike many school districts, we have a very aggressive preventive maintenance system through our partnership with Amoresco. A lot of districts don't have partnerships like that. They monitor and maintain our systems, and they do. Before COVID, we've been doing quarterly filter replacements, even though the typical guidance is only for twice a year. So we've always been aggressive with our maintenance and care for our HVAC systems. And unlike most districts, we have our own maintenance and HVAC teams that can respond on demand to any kind of interruption to the system. Others are waiting days to get a contracted provider in to take care of their problems. 4 of our 8 buildings are less than 15 years old. And in addition to our new schools, I think that somebody might need to hit mute.
I can take care of it.
Thank you. Sorry. So we have 4 new buildings out of our 8 buildings are relatively new in the last 15 years. And in addition to that, the systems at the Lincoln and the high school were completely replaced in 2010, including all new univents in every single room. And at that same time, as part of the same project, the rooftop units at the Beachmont School were replaced. It was determined at the time that those univents did not need to be replaced. At Garfield, as you all know, we just finished our boiler replacement project. And those univents are original to the building, but the building is only 30 years old. We're not looking at the kinds of systems that other districts are looking at that are 50 or 70 or 120 years old. And, while other districts are grappling with buildings that are 100 plus and may have never even had an effective HVAC system or systems that were not maintained, that's not our reality. And Carl and his team have constantly monitoring the system and servicing it whenever it needs servicing. But, as I'm sure you read in our reopening plan, we did hire an independent engineering firm just to come back and reassure people. They were in district all day today. They're going to be back all day tomorrow, checking air intakes and outflows in every room, and doing a complete audit of our HVAC systems and the air change capacity in all of our rooms. And, we know that some of our rooms, there have been times when we've taken one classroom and turned it into 2 in order to make more space for our overcrowded schools. In those examples, those kids and those teachers may need to be moved to a common space like a library or a cafeteria, which we're not going to be using in the traditional sense if we have in-person learning, in order to ensure that there's adequate ventilation and that those kids are in a room that has adequate ventilation. We'll do whatever EL Barrett tells us that we have to do. If they find faults in our system, then we will fix them. And as we said last week, no building is going to be opened until it's deemed safe to do so. So the reopening plan does detail how HVAC systems are going to be modified to maximize their air intake from the outside to ensure appropriate air exchange throughout the day. So we can make sure that we have adequate ventilation in our classrooms, regardless of whether the windows are open or not. This is going to have an impact on temperatures in classrooms because typically our HVAC systems are set to allow a certain volume of airflow that enables the incoming air to either be heated or cooled, depending on the season, sufficiently before it's expelled into the room. But with the increased air intake, the rapid intake of cold air will force colder air to be pushed into classrooms in the winter months. So those rooms will feel colder than what we are used to. And teachers and students, I would suggest at a minimum have to dress in layers in order to maximize their comfort. And the same kind of thing is going to happen in the warmer months where the rooms, because we're taking in more air from the outside, our rooms are going to be warmer than they typically are in the usual course of operating without the HVAC system pulling in 100% of air take. I think lunch was the last question. Is that right?
Yes.
So, the lunch question is a good question. And one thing that we are encouraging, especially in good weather, is that classes take their lunch outside and give the kids an actual chance to have their masks off for a little bit of time and be able to eat at an appropriate social distance, which is defined right now as 6 feet. I know that some of the medical professionals are saying that the gain of a 6 feet distance over a 3 feet distance is inconsequential, but we have elected to stay with the 6 feet separation, at least as we begin a plan to try to get back to school. And even if the kids are eating in the classroom, because their desks are 6 feet apart and their teacher is 6 feet away from the first row of desks, we feel that we will meet this guidance. And there were teachers on the reopening plan who felt it would be best to put in a rule that kids could not talk during lunch in order to reduce the opportunity for any droplets to be expelled while the rest of the classroom is present without a mask. And honestly, how is that going to happen? It's going to be through classroom management, with which the vast majority of our teachers are extraordinary at. And I'm sure you can all imagine a day in your academic career where you were in the class and a teacher said, "That's it, everybody knock it off," and everybody did. Because teachers have that kind of command over their classroom. And when we're talking about rooms that might have 10 or 12 in them at a time, it becomes even easier to manage behaviors than it does when you're in a classroom with 25 or 27 or even more kids in some cases. So I guess I'll just wrap up by saying this is all very important. And as you already said, these are unprecedented times. And we need to absolutely make sure that we are going slow and steady and taking the advice of the far more knowledgeable people than I am or than most of us are around what the guidance is and what we should be doing, as long as the needs of our kids are central to our decision making. And I do think that in Revere in particular, if our positivity rate doesn't come down, then I think it is safe to say that all of this discussion is going to inform actions that we're going to take further down the road instead of sooner. So I guess I'll stop there unless there's anything that I missed.
May I drill down for a second
Sure.
so if I understand correctly, you're saying that there will be no hybrid teaching if our positivity rate remains above 5% of positive tests, as in
Correct.
it. Okay, that's extremely helpful. I'd also like to drill down on the PPE piece for educators. Obviously, we need to protect our staff and educators at all costs. I think everybody here agrees, especially you. The RTA sort of return survey that was circulated this past weekend suggests that over 22% of our teaching staff self-identify as increased risk individuals. It's going to be incredibly important for them and all teachers, obviously, to receive the proper PPE. I know that you all are very concerned with what they're wearing and what resources they have available. But my question is, what resources specifically will the average teacher be provided in terms of PPE? Or will they also be required to bring their own masks, bring their own goggles, gloves, hand sanitizer, things like that?
They won't. We did, as I reported to the committee, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we did make a substantial investment in PPE throughout the district, including hand sanitizer, which is going to be in every classroom and at major junction points and hallways, lobby areas, offices, as will the wipes and the sanitary spray for surfaces. And we've ordered a significant amount of masks, gloves, and all of those pieces. So teachers will have that available. I would suggest that teachers do wear their own mask because they know what they're comfortable with. We're glad to hand them a paper one if that's what they want to wear. I don't know that it's recommended that that's the best thing for them on a daily basis. And I think that at this, I at least don't know an adult who doesn't have their own actual set of masks. The people that I know are coordinating with outfits and things like that. And we do have 10,000 masks, cloth masks, that Mayfair, the Moroccan organization in Revere, has donated to the school department. So we can give at least every kid and adult in our district at least one cloth mask. And I do know that there will be some adults who just say, I have my own, I'm good. And that will leave that mask in the pool to go to make sure that kids might have multiple cloth masks by the time we're through with it and see who has what of their own and who wants to take masks from us.
Sure. Do we think it's realistic that kids will be able to remember and bring masks every single day and only sort of have 2 or 3 chances to forget before their allotted extra mask number is sort of up in terms of the resources that we sort of possess right now? I guess that's my main concern. We know how forgetful children are. We know that not all families have the resources to provide their own PPE. It would suggest that a significant portion of our children are going to be coming to school fairly regularly without the proper resources. How are we going to handle that situation when we're out of masks? Because 10,000 sounds like a lot, but it might not be in the end, especially if we're doing this for a while.
Yeah. The paper mask that we ordered is more of the order of 250,000.
Okay.
So it's just the cloth masks that we have the 10,000 of. So I think that we will be in good stead with that order. In terms of kids forgetting, kids will forget. And I know it's going to be very much like what we've endured, I guess is the word I'll use, with student IDs at the middle school and high school level. Because kids lose them so frequently, we don't actually send the elementary kids home with them. They leave their IDs at school. We need their IDs in order to do our point of service sales with cafeterias and things like that. But we've managed with at least half of our kids to navigate the I forgot my ID. And I think that we'll develop systems where we learn to navigate the I forgot my mask in a similar fashion. So.
Great. Thank you. And just to summarize your last point, I do want to be clear, there will be no in-person teaching of any kind unless we drop below 5%.
That's correct.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately that's a school decision. So I shouldn't be saying that, but I would not recommend to the school committee that they open schools if our positivity rate stays above 5%, as that is a threshold that's been nationally recognized as a point where we shouldn't be gathering.
Absolutely. Sorry, I meant your recommendation, but thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question, Anthony, and hopefully Diane and maybe Adrian can address it. But first, to make a comment, the proactivity, no one wants it as high as it is, but we also have to remember it is higher mostly because we have been so aggressive in testing in the city. So the numbers are going to go up. And I believe Adrian can also acknowledge today we had great numbers. I think there's one. So compared to what 2 weeks ago when we started doing a lot more testing with Fallon Ambulance coming in, and then now today only being one, I just don't want people to really get nervous about this as like we're a complete big hot spot. We've been doing a lot of testing in the city and that would bring the numbers up. And I'm glad people are being tested. It makes me happy. Sad that we have to go through it, but happy that they're being proactive. I do have a question. I don't know, Adrian, if you can help out if Diane doesn't have the answer. Are there any of our 3 models being linked to public health indicators? And if so, are there benchmarks?
So I'll just say briefly like that, what we just said about my not recommending to the school committee that we do any kind of in-person learning if the positivity rate doesn't go below 5% would be an example of that, but I'll let Adrian say more about what's happening in the city and any of those pieces.
Well, so I can say that most of those numbers with those graphs are numbers that we have had since before we've been doing the mobile testing, and our mobile testing numbers are high. We had, I think, 14 cases yesterday and only 3 today total. And we're going to see more when people test, certainly, but that mobile testing is not the only spot that we're getting our positive cases from. So, I mean, in the end, we want to know who's positive because we want them out of the general population of people who can keep infecting. And that's why we need to keep testing.
If I may address Ms. Rizzo's point quickly as well. Thank you.
It wasn't done though, Anthony. You had 35 minutes. Can we have some?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to address a specific, but go ahead.
So, Adrian, do you have any idea of what we're going to consider as far as the indicators, other than the proactivity?
You know,
or has it been talked about?
I mean, as far as the 5%, that's our big benchmark.
I would like to see more. Diane, as far as the CARES Act, do we really think that that money is going to cover everything? And also, they were talking about $225 per student of a new funding source. Did you hear of anything like that? Because I want all the money we can.
Yeah, I did. That was the piece that I had put in the email on, I forget whatever day. I emailed you guys about the budget. When was that? Friday, maybe? Or Saturday?
With the good news, yes.
Yes. So that included, that was that $1.6 million, which is part of the CARES Act funding that the state got, which they have reallocated to school districts. So that is funding that is going to augment our Chapter 70 funding, which, as you know, was about 70 million, as opposed, maybe it was 71. I forget now exactly what the numbers were. I don't have them in front of me. But that will help us with different costs associated with reopening through our, in addition to, in companion with our Chapter 70 funding.
Okay, that's good.
If I may address a point you made earlier, just so we don't get too far ahead, I do want to say that we absolutely are a hot spot right now. I mean, you mentioned, Ms. Rizzo, that more testing, of course, leads to more cases.
Mrs.
Thank Rizzo, I apologize.
I work hard for that title.
Yeah, absolutely. But more testing leads to more cases. That's absolutely true. That's why Dr. Kelly and Mrs. McGuire, we all mentioned the positive test case rate, which should remain consistent regardless of how much you're testing. That is the rate of tests given that turn positive. And we're at 6.5% right now, which absolutely indicates sort of hotspot level contagion, according to the CDC. That number should not fall victim to more or less tests being given because it's a rate of positive tests per test given. So just to clarify, we absolutely are a hotspot right now, and we're trending sort of even more dangerously into hotspot territory and have been over the course of the past 2 weeks. Yes, Miss Gravellisi. I think she's muted.
Oh, can she not unmute?
It seems as though she's stuck.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you to the host for unmuting me.
I thought that kids could unmute themselves. I'm sorry.
It wouldn't allow me to. I want to first thank Dr. Kelly for clarifying all of those questions that Mr. D'Ambrosio brought up today. I think that, you know, the clarification will make people feel a little bit more at ease about the reopening, regardless of whether we are 100% remote or a hybrid model. I think it goes without saying, you know, thank you for sharing the slide from the City of Revere website. I know myself, and I'm sure every other member here, I've checked it daily since March 14th when all of this came out. So I do check it daily. And I believe, and I can't speak for the others, that we would all agree with the 6.5% rate that none of us would feel comfortable letting the children go into school. I mean, we do want to stop the spread. We do not want an outbreak. You know, and also with testing rates, I'm extremely happy that Revere's testing. The more testing, the better, the more positive cases. You know, we need to know who's out there. And, you know, earlier, Ms. Rizzo, when you said, you know, we're testing a lot, I know I've heard that from so many people, like, well, you're testing a lot, but we have to. Just because we're testing a lot means we need to find these people that are out there. I use the analogy, if we had a room full of 20 adults that were diabetic and we only tested 10 of them and 10 of them were positive for diabetes, it doesn't mean that the other 10 aren't also diabetic. So I try to use that analogy with people when they say, why are we testing so much? That's why it's such an outbreak. So like I said, with our rate of 6.5%, like, I feel that again, I can't speak for the whole committee, but I know I wouldn't be comfortable with the children returning to school until we see that CDC guideline of 5% or less. That's all I wanted to say.
Mr. Franti.
And if I could just add to that, I think that to make a decision right now on August 3rd, like there's so much to look at and so much to consider, and it's one of the things that makes this so complicated. But we already know that however we come back to school, the beginning of the year is likely to involve several days of professional development with teachers. That still needs to be negotiated with the union, but I think it's safe to anticipate that we would be looking at several days of professional development at the start of the school year. And so if we were talking about the possibility of kids coming back in person, we would be looking at around the middle of September or later. That's 6 weeks away from now. And for better or for worse, we've all seen how rapidly things change with COVID. And I just wouldn't want to see the committee lock itself into a position until it's necessary that we become locked into a position. And my own opinion, which I shared at the virtual town hall, was that should happen around the time of next week when you are going to vote on which plan I should submit to the Department of Education. And I don't know that a whole lot will change between now and then, but I think that we owe it to the kids to make sure that we have all of the right information before we make that decision. And I think that we should also be talking at that time about whichever mode the school committee selects to go back in. I mean, we're gonna go back. It might be fully remote or it might be hybrid. As Mr. D'Ambrosio mentioned, we don't have the kind of infrastructure in Revere that we can entertain the idea of coming back fully. So looking at those two positions, whichever one we move into, we need to be planning in case, well, if we start off remote, we need to be planning to get into hybrid as soon as we can. And if we start off hybrid, we need to be planning to switch to remote if we have to very quickly. So.
Just a quick interjection. May I remind my colleagues of open meeting law? If everyone is going to express their opinion right now, that becomes an illegal vote. So, and also like Diane said, this is so fluid. We don't know what's going to happen in 6 weeks. So we can make our statements, but our decisions need to be left to a public meeting. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't think we're making any decisions here. I mean, this is a great conversation that we need to be having. Mr. Ferranti, did you still have your hand up?
Yeah. Well, she sort of answered it because I really wanted to know what was the drop dead date for the rate, going under 5%. And it looks like that she said it would be next week would be the determination. But for some reason, if the numbers sort of dip between, say, now and a couple of weeks after our decision, is there a possibility to relook at this situation, Diane? Remote versus, the hybrid.
Yeah, and I think that it gets a little bit tricky for parents. So I think that if the committee was to vote to go to a hybrid model, it might be a little bit easier to pull back from that. I think that if you vote to do a fully remote model, it's going to be difficult to move to a hybrid model from that position. That would probably take a little bit more doing. And as long as we're all just sharing thoughts and ideas, I'll share with you that one of my worries is if we can't find a way to come back in a hybrid model, are we ever going to find a way to come back in a hybrid model? It's one of the things that I worry about, that we might never get to a space where we feel like even if there's vaccination at the end of this year or at the start of next year, I'm just wondering if the public mindset then will be, well, we need to wait and see what happens with the vaccine. We need to watch the trials and see if it's effective. And so I just, one of the things that keeps me awake at night is worrying about some kids that might have some different kind of mental health and social emotional needs that haven't been met adequately since March. And I worry that they won't be met, particularly for kids that we haven't already identified as having those needs. Every year, new cases surface for us in the school department. And I just worry that those cases will continue to go undiscovered. And it's not an insignificant thing for the committee to keep as part of their thought process.
Yeah, but Diane, I think that becomes another problem, because I know we have to be flexible and things change by the day, it seems here, with the testing and everything. And, if we start out with the remote thing and then say 30 days later, we go back to the hybrid, and then we have another problem, we have to change back to remote. Don't you think that's going to confuse it worse than what it could possibly be when we start the process? I mean, I understand the numbers, and I understand that the 5% is the baseline of doing the hybrid. But I sort of think we got to be a little bit consistent and make it easy for the parents and the students that we're not changing on the fly, realizing that we have to have some flexibility of what's going to happen here. There could be a possibility we don't get back at all this year. I mean, anything's possible right now. I mean, we just don't know what's going to happen. But just to make my last question, that all the testing we're doing, and I think Adrian can answer this one, because we know the addresses where people live, is some of the testing numbers skewed a little bit because people that don't live in the city?
Certainly, I can answer that for you. So we're only reporting on the results of people from Revere.
You answer the question. Thank you.
Do you mind if I invite Joanna and Wes just to see if they wanted to add anything in terms of servicing students with special needs?
Please do. Ms. Ty, did you have your hand up? I think she's muted.
Okay. I don't know how these are getting muted.
Thank you. Just an observation. I think it's clear to everyone and to everyone to whom I've been talking that the 5% is the almost nationally and maybe universally accepted benchmark. So I don't think we need to be concerned about that. I think we're all on board on that. But I'm sensitive to what Mrs. Rizzo had to say about the open meeting law. But I'd like to know something about the professional development, because this is a question I have been asked. In the 10 days that we are supposed to be doing professional development, are those 10 days in which the teachers will be taught, or will some of that time be devoted to what the teachers will teach and how they will be teaching? I mean, in general, our professional development in the beginning starts with a visionary statement. Sometimes then we split up and do other things. So the question is, are we talking about 10 days or 10 days and perhaps some more to be devoted to, for example, planning lessons that can be used in concert with other teachers?
So I'll start by saying that the commissioner has completed a memorandum of agreement with the major unions to allow for up to 10 days at the start of the school year. It does have to be at the start of the school year to be dedicated to teacher professional development. It's up to the school committee and the teachers union to negotiate exactly how many of those 10 days the Revere teachers would engage in. And it would be up to the school department to develop a program of professional development that would adequately enable teachers to teach effectively in whatever format we're working out of. So our curriculum directors, and Joanna and Wes can probably speak to this too, have been talking about what such a program would look like. And certainly at least one of the days would be dedicated to appropriate hygiene and appropriate cleaning of the space, their own personal hygiene, and educating children about the hygiene for kids. They would also be trained in use of PPE to make sure that people are actually wearing their masks in the way that they're supposed to, and not otherwise, as we often see elsewhere in society. And the rest of the time would be dedicated to making sure that they have depth of knowledge about any. We are in a remote platform. One of the decisions that the teams have made is that we're going to consolidate into specific types of online platforms instead of having different platforms at different schools at different grade levels. We're all navigating through the Google Suite, so that parents and students don't have to year by year get used to what school they're attending. And then the rest of the time, teachers would be actually working together to develop the 2-week curriculum units that we envisioned for if we had a hybrid model where the kids would have direct instruction for a week, and then their at-home piece would be to work on some kind of a performance task related to that direct instruction, where the kids would have some choice in how they demonstrated their knowledge, but would apply that knowledge through a deeper learning experience to a real world situation, as opposed to here's the worksheet with 45 of the same division problem, go do them all. And, you know, as we had talked about at the town hall, one of the ways we envisioned that happening would be that we would have teachers that are teaching the kids who are present during a hybrid model. And we would have a different cadre of teachers, most likely the ones that Anthony spoke about earlier, who had some immunocompromised problems that prevent them from teaching in person. who would actually manage the remote learning. And, because we would have different teachers, the vision is that you would be doing the same unit 1, whether you were in 2nd grade at the Wayland School or 2nd grade at the Paul Revere, whether you were participating in the hybrid system or if you were learning entirely remotely. And that way we would have some equity for learning services across all of the platforms. If we're in an entirely hybrid system, we would still hope to do the same kind of program. We want to be able to switch back and forth very fluidly between in-person and remote based on different peaks with the virus. So we still want to have those comprehensive 2-week units. The question will become how we differentiate between the people who would have been the in-person teacher,
Right.
the people who would have been the fully remote teacher, and what their responsibilities are. And that's, again, something that we still have to work out with the union, because even if we start fully remote and we are able to move down the road to a hybrid situation, we will still have teachers who can't come into a hybrid model. And to the extent that we can, we want to accommodate their health needs. We need to under FERPA if we have, or HIPAA, sorry. We have to make sure that we accommodate their needs if they're able to do their job with a modified program.
That was another question about teachers who might have severe health issues.
Mhm.
And you answered it.
Thank you, Ms. Ty. I guess I'm still considering this vaccine development question because I think that it has to play a crucial role in whatever decision and recommendation is given or made at this point. The most recent data is incredibly encouraging, and obviously anything can happen when vaccines enter the 3 phases of clinical trials and preclinical trials. But if the data does continue to look as encouraging as it does now in subsequent weeks, what role will that play in your own internal sort of recommendation progress? Because if we do have something that's widely distributable and effective by the end of this year or early next year, this whole sort of process of trying to rush kids back, it seems unnecessarily harmful if our distribution capabilities are what they appear to likely be in a few months. So what role is the vaccination data playing in your recommendations over the course of the next few weeks?
I still feel like the one threshold point that should push us away from a hybrid model would be the positivity rate. And beyond that, if we can get that number under control, I think that we should be looking at, especially for our high need students, and even if we're in a full remote model, and I'll let Wes and Joanna speak to this, there are some kids that we might want to still look at if we're in a full remote model, allowing to come in and have their learning take place in person in school. And that would be our severe needs small learning group kids. And there are other kids that we need to think of as well who have supplemental services like occupational therapy and physical therapy, who we still need to think about bringing in physically to receive their services that we still have to provide regardless of what model we're in. So Joanna, you want to speak to that?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. You are right that regardless of the type of plan that we do come back in, there's a portion of our student population with significant developmental delays, global delays, and physical disabilities. Typically, those students also have some immunocompromised conditions that we have to consider as well. And so when we think about the students that we want to bring in for that face-to-face, it's going to go down to, we're going to have those one-on-one conversations with families and weigh out the risks of bringing them back for some in-person instruction or having them stay home and do completely remote. It's something that we're going to have to wait on before we make any more decisions, but those are the types of things that will be done family by family. And then we'll also have to look at the staffing that will need to go into those kinds of programs.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Excellent points.
Wes, did you want to add anything for the secondary level?
I agree with Ms. Rizzo. These are important years for a number of our students where remote can't appropriately meet their needs. It's a hard balance, but our students should be in front of our decision-making process. So, thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Do any of the subcommittee or general committee members have anything else they'd like to ask, as we're running on about an hour here, and I'd like to be respectful of everybody's time? Well, in that case, oh, Mr. Rizzo, Mrs.
No,
Rizzo.
just my final words as far as, Joanne, don't laugh at me. That we need to listen to the professionals, whether it's health agencies, whether it's building maintenance. These are people that we have to depend on. We can read everything from CDC, from here to Japan, but we need to depend on these people to give us the right information for us to make the best decisions for our community. There's no one here on the school committee or in this district that wants any of our students or staff to be harmed. We have friends, we have family. We have always been a close community, no matter how big. So I just want to make sure we get all the information possible, and dependent if it's 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, if we have to change, we have to be as fluid as this pandemic has been. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Ms. Rizzo, and thank you to everybody who came out tonight. I know all of your schedules are super hectic, especially those of you working on the reopening team, and especially Dr. Kelly. I can't even imagine right now. I think, as Mrs. Rizzo mentioned, we're all in agreement that this issue has more moving pieces than sort of anything we could have imagined, and it's an incredibly difficult task that nobody should be, in an ideal world, tasked with fixing. And I think we all agree that we do not want to put our teachers, our students, our staff, and family members at risk in this situation. So I appreciate you all being here today, and with that, and with the best protection of the community in mind, I move to close the meeting as we think about ways to combat this issue in the next few weeks.
Motion to adjourn.
Seconded.
Thank
All
you.
in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Joanna and Wes, for your input, and Adrian. Very appreciated.
Thank you for being here, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Night,
We
everyone.
really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
See you soon.